Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our final paper, our second keynote address. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Oliver Freiberger. Professor Freiberger's primary research interests include the history of Buddhism in South Asia, asceticism, religious boundary making, and comparison in the study of religion. In my own experience, I'm particularly interested in his early work where he brought attention to the polyvocal dimension of the polycanon. And in his most recent book, Considering Comparison, Professor Freiberger develops a methodological framework for conducting and evaluating comparative studies. He is both an innovative scholar and a generous colleague, and I might add, a wicked shuffleboard player. So be careful if you ever try to play shuffleboard against Professor Freiberger. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Oliver Freiberger, whose paper today is called Comparing Religion Within and Beyond South Asia.
Thank you, Brian, for the introduction. Of course, Brian is very, very modest. He always won the shuffleboard plays at the end. Yes, you did. Thank you so much. It's great to see you again after a long time, and great to see everyone else. Thank you, first of all, to Avni and Karen for inviting me to give this talk, and also to Naomi Appleton, who invited me already last year to the symposium that was unfortunately had to be canceled. Now, since I'm the final speaker, let me thank you on behalf of everyone for putting together such an amazing symposium with truly fascinating papers and discussions. I found it really, really nice, and I learned a lot, at least up to this point. So from now on, it's probably only going downhill, but it's only 1 hour left. So just leave right now, and you have gotten the full experience. So let me share the screen. Before I start, I just wanted to address my short and somewhat awkward title, Comparing Religion Within and Beyond South Asia. The most important word here is the first one. I will talk about comparison as a method for the study of religion and its potential risks and benefits. Second, I did not use the misleading plural religions because it's not about comparing entire religions, but religious ideas, practices, processes, etc. Hence the all-encompassing abstract singular word and also awkward word, religion. And finally, I will try to demonstrate that comparisons within the cultural context of South Asia are, from a methodological perspective, not fundamentally different from comparisons of South Asian material with non-South Asian material. And I will argue that one can do this responsibly and productively. The latter claim in particular, that cross-cultural comparison may be a viable method, has often been dismissed. The words comparison and study of religion in the same sentence give many scholars an uneasy feeling. Even those who compare religious things strictly within one cultural context, say South Asia, often do not want to be called comparativists. To be sure, comparing data is one of the most fundamental operations of scholarship, from comparing manuscripts in the preparation of a critical edition, to comparing ideas of various authors or iconographic details in various images, to comparing last year's performance of an annual ritual to this year's performance. All these operations represent commonly applied variants of the comparative method. So why the hesitancy in embracing comparativism related to religion more broadly? My guess is that in the study of religion, which is rarely called comparative religion anymore these days, the comparative method is viewed with suspicion because many associate it with classical phenomenological approaches that have fallen out of fashion, such as Mircea Eliades. Key here is the cross-cultural dimension, and with that comes a critique that can best be captured by the term decontextualization. Decontextualization is the most commonly identified problem in comparative studies. The critique goes like this. When you compare two things, possibly even in two different cultures, you artificially isolate them from their respective contexts. Their unique contextual meanings get lost, and you end up with two objects that appear similar only because the scholar chose to bring them together in this study, most likely by following a certain ideological agenda. Thus, what is being compared has already been compromised by being removed from its context, and the alleged similarities, and also some differences, are superficial and really only a result of scholarly biases rather than empirical research. Before I discuss this critique more, let me point out that I believe much of it is valid. I'll come back to that in a moment, but I disagree with some critics on what follows from the criticism and what it means for future scholarship. Let us first listen to what critics have to say. Already in 1982, the Dutch scholar Jan Platvoet said about classical phenomenology, which he classified as, quote, an unlimited comparative study of religion, the following. It was and is permitted to the student of this discipline, namely classical phenomenology, to collect his materials for comparison from an unlimited number of heterogeneous religions, over the sources of which he could not possibly exercise the required control. Consequently, he often had only a superficial knowledge of much of the materials used. He also paid no systematic attention to the very diverse interpretive frameworks of the authors from whose works he collected his materials. Unquote. What Platvoet calls superficiality here is related to decontextualization, gathering material from multiple religious sources that one is not very familiar with, and ignoring diversity means to decontextualize. Platvoet's description of his own, what he calls limitative approach, makes this clear. He says, by this method, the limitative approach, his own approach, by this method, minute analyses are obtained, which approximate the empirical religious reality as closely as the historical materials available allow. Students of religion who are intent on respecting the singularities of the empirical religious realities are compelled by such minute analyses to devise a theoretical approach to comparison in which the particularities of each of the religions and religious processes to be compared can be amply accommodated. For Platvoet, legitimate comparison is only possible when the scholar has a full grasp of the respective local contexts and respects their particularities. He then goes on in his study to compare rituals in certain religious communities in Africa, South America, and the United States, over whose sources he is confident he has scholarly control. Fast forward 35 years. In his 2017 book about comparison in the study of religion, the influential American scholar Aaron Hughes advocates the study of local contexts as well, but he goes one step further and dismisses cross-cultural comparison altogether. He says, if comparison is to be an effective method, it must be historical and not phenomenological, local and not global. By this I mean that while cross-cultural comparisons may appear eye-catching or useful, X in Hinduism, for example, is like Y in Christianity, such results are at best idiosyncratic, that is, contingent on the particular needs of the comparativist, and rarely, if ever, verifiable. A much more useful type of comparison is one that emerges from those places where contiguous or overlapping social groups speak the same literal language and think with the same metaphorical vocabulary. And elsewhere, he puts it even more bluntly. He says, for me, comparison cannot be cross-cultural, comparing texts or phenomena from different times and places. Hughes' approach is a consistent rejection of decontextualization. Comparison is possible, but only within a local context, in which, as he says, overlapping social groups speak the same literal language. This means that for him, only homological comparisons are legitimate. That is, comparisons of items that are closely related and that can thus be adequately contextualized. The idea that the focus on a local context alone can produce meaningful scholarship is, among other things, a legacy of postmodern approaches that developed after the Second World War, and as a response to fascist master narratives, emphasized difference. Hughes' approach explicitly abandons analogical comparisons, that is, comparisons in which the scholar sees analogies between items that are not necessarily related, X in Hinduism and Y in Christianity, as he puts it. Say, the worship of deities, theological concepts, initiation rituals, or the religious justification of violence in different cultures. Such things must not be compared cross-culturally, says Hughes. That means also that Plattfoot's earlier micro-comparison of rituals on 3 continents, no matter how localized, would not be legitimate either. I think this radical dismissal goes against common sense, but it also abolishes one of the most fundamental tasks religious studies has, forming theories with categories such as veneration, mythology, ritual, that are applicable to more than one context. Even the term religion, a highly abstract comparative category, would not be applicable to contexts in which it is not used. Following through with this approach, nothing in the roughly 3,000 years of documented pre-modern Indian history could be identified as religion, because that would imply that the respective phenomenon was cross-culturally comparable to Western religious phenomena. But if we don't simply want to ignore the issue of decontextualization, what can we do instead? First, I propose that we take a close look at what we actually mean when we say context. Sure, it refers to the historical, political, and socioeconomic conditions of a certain situation, but it can potentially refer to much more. We can think of many different contextual layers and dimensions, such as the literary context, the philosophical, the legal, the linguistic, the ecological, the military, the technological, the artistic, or the architectural context, to name just a few. I claim that no single study, no matter how context-focused, can exhaustively consider all those dimensions. To give just one example, when we undertake historical contextualization, we focus on a point in time and ask, how did it come to this situation and what followed from it? But determining a historical context is potentially endless, since you can always go deeper into history to study the antecedents of the studied item. What a meaningful limit of this contextualization might be is at the discretion of the scholar. Thus, it is very easy to accuse a study of decontextualizing simply by demanding more, and we have all seen this in book reviews. To be truly constructive, such a criticism must provide a solid explanation of what would be gained by expanding the context. Moreover, even studies that thoroughly consider the context are always interested in particular items or aspects. It's not for nothing that we speak of a context of the item, of that which is literally woven together with this item. In a study, this particular item is linguistically and theoretically set apart. We study a certain ritual action, a certain religious concept, a certain process. Whenever you compare this item with another item, even one that is contextually close, you distinguish them from their context. One could say you decontextualize. Those two items are now at the center of your attention, and the context takes a backseat. Even an extremely detailed study will never be able to fully consider all aspects of their context simultaneously during a comparative process. If it did, it would not compare the two items anymore. It would be about everything, and no study is. Thus, it seems that decontextualization is inevitable for comparative studies, and that it is also inherent in any study that focuses on one item and thereby sets it apart from its context. Therefore, I suggest that the key is to embrace this fact and stand by a controlled decontextualization, which means reflecting upon and being transparent about what exactly one sets aside in a study, and explaining why that is justifiable in view of one's research question. Or to put it in a different way, one needs to identify and thoroughly study those dimensions of the context that are relevant for answering the research question. That requires the researcher to be modest and realistic about their goals, and it requires potential critics to be specific about which additional aspects of the respective context would have improved the study in their mind, and why. A generic lament that a study is problematic because it decontextualizes will not do. Reflecting on how to delineate the appropriate context for a specific research question brings us to an even more fundamental issue. Why do I study a particular item and not a different one? In other words, how do I pick my data and my research question? For comparative studies, it comes down to determining the three fundamental components of a comparison. The two items that are to be compared, the comparants, could be more than two, and the third of comparison, the tertium comparationis, which is the aspect in view of which I compare the two items. William Payden explained this concisely when he wrote, "Comparison is the study of two or more objects in terms of a common factor in relation to which either the differences or the similarity of the objects can become explicit and understood." This common factor, the tertium comparationis, is crucial for every comparison. It reflects the scholar's research question and determines, to a large degree, how the comparants and their contexts are delineated. Say I plan a mountain vacation and need to buy proper shoes. Let's also assume that there is no pandemic and I can actually go to a shoe store. In that store, I will then compare various pairs of hiking shoes in view of certain tertia comparationis, such as sturdiness, water resistance, comfort, price, and yes, looks. There will be similarities and differences, but the purpose of the inquiry clearly limits potential comparants. I will not even start to consider cowboy boots, sandals, or flip-flops, which also means that I ignore major parts of the context, namely entire sections of that well-equipped store. This decontextualization seems unproblematic because I clearly specified my goal, finding shoes that would work best for my hiking trip. In this scenario, nobody will seriously blame me for not considering flip-flops. My point is that the tertium comparationis, the aspect in view of which we compare items, is an important factor in our selection of comparants. What is obvious in my visit to the shoe store is not always clearly acknowledged in comparative studies of religion. But because the tertium comparationis is so crucial, we must spend time and effort to specify what our research purpose is. Self-reflection and transparency are key. I suggest that with such an approach, it is legitimate to compare items also from different cultural contexts, as I will try to demonstrate in a moment. But first, I need to address one more point that is related to the criticism of comparison. Earlier, I mentioned the distinction between homological and analogical comparisons. In a certain way, this distinction reflects the difference between comparing items within one cultural context on the one hand, and comparing with a cross-cultural scope on the other. Biologists distinguish between homologies and analogies like this. Homologies are similarities that are based on being evolutionary related and having a common ancestor, while analogies are similarities that are caused by environmental circumstances. For example, unlike sharks, dolphins and whales are mammals and have horizontal tail fins. That is a homology. At the same time, both dolphins and sharks have a streamlined body shape, flippers and fins, all of which allow them to swim faster when they hunt prey. These body traits evolved independently. Dolphins and sharks are not related, yet they have similar traits. That is an analogy. Please forgive this simplistic explanation. The parallel hopefully will make sense in a moment. In a recent book chapter, the German scholar Michael Burgunder offers a post-colonial perspective on comparative religion. The chapter focuses on a pertinent issue, namely the fact that most, if not all, categories used in cross-cultural comparative approaches, God, myth, ritual, etc., are rooted in European cultural history. He argues that when comparativists choose as the point of comparison, the tertium comparationis, an aspect that emerges from a familiar phenomenon in their own culture, this phenomenon works as a prototype with which one compares phenomena from other cultures. Since those can never measure up to the prototype, the comparative method is inherently Eurocentric. Building on post-colonialist historian Dipesh Chakrabarty's work, Burgunder suggests a strict historicization of the point of comparison, which means that categories should no longer be used without critically exploring their globally entangled histories since 19th century colonialism, which gave rise to European prototypes, unquote. He further suggests that, quote, we learn to accept that our comparative concepts have a history that needs to be disclosed as a prerequisite for any further use, unquote. This history, Burgunder notes, is global and entangled, meaning that in the 19th and 20th centuries, those originally European categories spread across the globe, in the process of which they changed and multiplied their respective meanings. He argues that it is precisely this global use that makes comparative studies possible. Religious phenomena can be compared because they have been identified by local actors in their respective local contexts as religious, this term being a local appropriation of the originally European concept. When we use comparison for exploring the genealogy of categories, we study homologies. That is, similarities that are due to historical relations and a common ancestor. Here, the European concept. We study dolphins and whales, but not sharks. That is important work that has a broader scope than Aaron Hughes' radical restriction to local contexts that we encountered earlier. But by stating that studying the history of those categories is a prerequisite for any further use, Burgunder suggests that they should not be used as analytical cross-cultural categories until further notice. Rooted as it is in postcolonialism's deep suspicion of Western scholarly meta-language, this approach too precludes analogical comparison, a comparison that identifies and studies interesting common properties or phenomena that are not genealogically related, like the fins of dolphins and sharks. Postmodern and postcolonial critiques have taught us that there is no innocent or objective study of cultures. But if we want to take the problem of scholarly bias seriously, I believe we must dig even deeper. And the same applies to the epistemology of comparison itself. Let me mention only a few points here. In my recent book, I propose a scholar-centered approach that explores the situatedness of the individual scholar more holistically, their personal background and preferences, cultural embeddedness, and academic training. Many aspects in these three areas contribute to the configuration and the eventual shape of a comparative study. Which items get picked as comparands, and in view of which point they are being compared, the tertium comparationis, is all determined by the scholar's personal, cultural, and academic setting. On the other hand, we must also acknowledge the scholar's agency, one's ability to reflect upon the situatedness and to be transparent about it, as well as what I call controlled decision-making. While every researcher is situated in a web of multiple influences, they also control to a considerable degree the decisions that are made in their research. For example, when they criticize and deconstruct an established scholarly approach or category and suggest new approaches and categories. And since the researcher must take scholarly responsibility publicly for the decisions made in the study, to a certain degree, these decisions are also controlled by the academic community. Controlled decision-making in this dual sense therefore reflects aspects of tradition and innovation, as it were. Decisions in selecting the comparands and the tertium comparationis are made in relation to what is considered interesting and relevant in the disciplinary discourse at that moment in time. And the researcher ideally adds something new and innovative to the discourse by selecting comparands and a tertium that have not been studied before in this particular combination. If we follow this model, all categories which grow out of tertia comparationis are always preliminary and dynamic. Let me give a recent example. In his 2017 book, Cross-Cultural Perspectives on Hagiographical Strategies, Massimo Rondolino compares Latin texts that describe the life of the 13th century Christian monk Saint Francis with Tibetan texts about the 12th century Buddhist master Milarepa. This comparative study is cross-cultural and analogical. Rondolino compares texts that he classifies as hagiographies, that is the analogical category, which is informed here by both Christian lives of saints and the Namtar genre of Tibetan literature. The study refines this category in important ways by identifying specific narrative tropes and by demonstrating that both the Christian and the Buddhist authors employed particular methods of presenting the saint's life and rewrote earlier accounts in certain ways. That the hagiographies play an important role in the larger religio-political agendas and theological visions of their authors, and that religious competition is a major factor in the hagiographical process. Clearly, there's no direct historical link between the two saints or the authors of the texts. And the word hagiography is as European as they come. But Rondolino demonstrates that as a category, carefully defined and open for further refinement, it seems quite useful for the study of religion. Granted that the study texts from two different cultures fall under one category is a scholarly assumption, one that is based purely on analogical comparison. My point is that in order for this category to work, it has to prove its usefulness in the disciplinary discourse of religious studies. If that comparison were totally idiosyncratic, as Aaron Hughes would probably claim, the category hagiography, as defined by Rondolino, would make sense only to himself. I find that hard to imagine. And if the category were so predefined by its European roots that it could not but distort the Tibetan texts, as Michael Burgunder might argue, I would ask for an exact analysis of this particular case that proves the category's inapplicability. And for this, we would in fact need cross-cultural analogical comparison again. This is the other side of comparison that critics often ignore. It's not only about finding similarities, but also about identifying differences. Again, refusing to apply the category hagiography to medieval Tibetan texts, only because that word originated in European history, would not suffice. Finally, I wish to address what perhaps should have been the first question. What is the goal of comparative studies, whether contextual or cross-cultural? Why bother at all? I propose that there are two major ways in which comparison can produce important insights for the study of religion. First, as we saw, comparison is crucial in the formation of scholarly categories and in the ongoing process of revisiting and refining them. The academic discipline of religious studies is in charge of classifying religious things, and comparison is at the heart of this taxonomic endeavor. Rondolino's study, which refined and enriched the category hagiography, is a good example. It provides scholars of religion with a rich analytical framework that can be applied to other cases and thereby possibly refined and enriched in different ways. If we study certain texts or historical processes through the lens of such an analytical framework of hagiography, we may come to new insights about those texts and processes, and more broadly put, we learn more about religion. Secondly, comparison provides new perspectives on an item that I already know very well: a religious text, a concept, a practice. Comparing it with another item provides a foil by which aspects that may have previously been overlooked get highlighted. It may expose potential blind spots. I learn more about my studied item when I compare it to a different one. Some aspects get illuminated, and I can describe it in new ways. This is a fairly obvious point for everyone who has used parallel cases within one context. To demonstrate that this illuminative function can also work cross-culturally, let me draw on my own comparative study of asceticism in pre-modern India and in late antique Christian Egypt. The sources for this micro-comparative study were classical Brahmanical texts of renunciation, the Samyasa Upanishads, composed in Sanskrit, and the sayings of the Desert Fathers, or Apophthegmata Patrum, in Greek and Latin. Since there is no indication that these two collections of texts or their authors are historically connected in any way, the study is clearly analogical. I picked these collections because I was interested in asceticism, a category that I initially defined rather broadly. And the plan was to study the similarities and differences of ascetic ideas or practices in these two cultural contexts. As it turned out, however, the sources were so heterogeneous within themselves that it was impossible to identify the early Christian or the classical Brahmanical version of asceticism. Rather, each collection displayed a discourse on what the best ascetic life is supposed to look like, and I could identify multiple opinions within each. In fact, the issues the authors of the collections argued about were very similar, and I was able to describe patterns of argumentation, hierarchies of values, and spectra of individual ascetic practices that appeared in both sources. That doesn't mean that there were no differences, of course, but these differences were particularly illuminating. Let me give two examples. In the Samyasa Upanishads, abandoning all possessions is the highest form of renunciation, which includes one's clothes. A number of passages declare that the highest ranked ascetic goes about naked. Other passages don't agree, but that's not so important for the point I want to make here, which is that naked asceticism is a commonly advocated practice in those texts. That should not surprise any person who works on South Asia, considering that the naked sadhu has been a fixture of Indian society to this day. But not so in the cultural context of 4th, 5th century Egypt. The Christian Desert Fathers recommended various kinds of clothing, including the most disgusting and stinking rags. But complete nakedness was not a common ascetic practice. If you ask a scholar of late antique Egypt, their spontaneous response would probably be that nakedness was not a thing for the Desert Fathers. However, at closer look, we find a handful of passages in which nakedness is addressed and even praised. For instance, it is reported that one eminent Desert Father, Abbas Makarios, met two naked ascetics in the desert and admitted to them, "I am weak and cannot do as you do." And later he states, "I have not become a monk, but I have seen monks." Passages like these had been known, but rarely acknowledged as reflecting a particular form of asceticism. Nakedness was on the margins of the Desert Fathers' regular practice, but when it is mentioned, the authors speak about it with admiration as a form of complete renunciation that they themselves were too weak to accomplish. My awareness of the Indian context helped me highlight and acknowledge the presence of this ascetic variant also in the early Christian texts. Using the Samyasa Upanishads as a comparative foil illuminated this dark, neglected corner, if you will, of the Apophtygmata Patrum. The second example illuminates in the opposite direction. The Desert Fathers of Egypt mostly lived a sedentary life. They stayed in kelia, simple structures made of brick and clay, and some practiced seclusion, locked inside their kelion for long periods of time. Not everyone agreed with that this was the best practice, but again, that's not my point here. In the Samyasa Upanishads, the Brahmanical ascetic seems to be doing the exact opposite, constant, for some even aimless wandering. While this is such a dominant idea, the fact that the ascetic practice of staying in one place is mentioned too has not attracted much attention. In those few passages, the ascetic's radius is restricted. One passage says, quote, "A man who travels only to beg his food or to answer nature's calls, and who even then does not go beyond a yojana, is indeed totally lame," unquote. This metaphorical lameness is understood positively, as it is explained, as one of 6 means for attaining liberation. In this concept, the ascetic deliberately confines himself to a limited space and attempts to move as little as possible. One could argue that a yojana, probably a few miles, is still a significant radius, but it's more about the spirit here, traveling only for specific purposes, not as a lifestyle. Remarks in other passages seem to follow a similar approach, saying that a renouncer, quote, "should not wander about everywhere, na sarvatra samcharit," or that one who meditates on the self should carefully avoid long journeys, dura yatra. Corresponding to that spatial restriction is the practice of obtaining food, quote, in the manner of a python, ajagara vritya. Here, the renouncer stays in one place and waits for someone to bring him food, like a python that waits for its prey, as it is explained. This practice is associated with the highest ranking type of renouncer, the avadhuta. Again, studying the common and often discussed sedentary practice of the Desert Fathers encourages us to acknowledge the practice of staying at one place in the Samyasa Upanishads as a distinct ascetic option. Studying the Apoptygmata Patrum and comparing ascetic concepts illuminated the Brahmanical texts and highlighted this sedentary practice in them. To conclude, let me restate my firm conviction that the comparative method is highly useful and in fact essential for the study of religion. The reservations regarding decontextualization and the hesitations that are rooted in postmodern and postcolonial critiques are valid, but can be addressed and incorporated. My hope is that this fresh analysis of the comparative method will encourage scholars of religion to return to exciting comparative work. According to this analysis, comparing within the cultural context of South Asia is not fundamentally different from comparing beyond South Asia. When the researcher is self-reflective and transparent about the study's goal and procedure, when the comparants are well delineated and the tertium comparationis clearly defined, a comparative study can be conducted responsibly and productively, substantially furthering our understanding of religion in South Asia and beyond. Thank you.